So, picking up where we left off, we were coming up on the Crusades at the end of our last lecture, and we finished by kind of setting the scene. So this is roughly around 1100. Middle East is pretty much divided between three major empires. What remains of the Byzantine Empire, the Seljuk Empire, which, as I mentioned last time, was already beginning to politically fragment into a number of smaller kingdoms or sultanates, and then finally the Fatimid, the Shiite empire based in Cairo, roughly corresponding to modern-day Egypt. So what are the immediate events leading up to the Crusades? Well, the Byzantine Empire is really beginning to take a hit from an expanding Seljuk Empire. And so by 1081, really the frontier, the Byzantine Empire, with respect to the Islamic world, had become really small. The distance between the capital of Constantinople and the border. And so the Byzantine Empire by this time roughly limited to Constantinople and parts of Southeast Europe. And so there's really this feeling of being under threat, that they are on the verge of being annihilated. Probably the turning point was the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, a major battle between the Byzantine Empire and Seljuk Turks near Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, Anatolia being the geographical term for this territory, roughly corresponding to modern-day Turkey. And so, this was a complete and utter defeat for the Byzantine Empire. The emperor, in fact, had been captured, which, that's a pretty good indication that you lost in a very humiliating fashion. He was released shortly after that, but, being captured, never a good look for an emperor, and so shortly thereafter deposed. And so now the empire had lost much of its Anatolian heartland. And again, the frontier with respect to the Islamic world, very, very close to the capital of Constantinople, a real feeling that one more major defeat could mean the end of the Byzantine Empire. So that brings us to the next emperor, Emperor Alexius I Komnenos. And, at some point feeling threatened, he called to Western Europe for aid. And more specifically, he reached out to the Pope. And I should note that by this time, there has really emerged a major schism or division between the Roman Catholic world, which recognizes the Pope as having ultimate authority, and the world of Christian Orthodoxy. At this point in history, pretty much centered around the Byzantine Empire. But today, of course, Orthodoxy is the form of Christianity you would find not just in Greece, but also in Russia and much of East Europe. And so, they don't recognize the Pope as having any particular authority. And at this historical point in time, the Byzantine Empire would have been probably the most important figure within Orthodoxy. So he's reaching out to Pope Urban II. His real name was Otho of Lagery, by the way. When you become Pope, you're given a new title, a new name. But in any event, what is he looking for? What he wants is for Western European soldiers or knights to come and fight under the Byzantine banner, right? And his main concern is pushing back the Seljuks and reclaiming lost territory. And that pretty much is the extent of what he's hoping for. But it's going to, so when he sends out this call for help, it's eventually going to have consequences much greater than what he had anticipated. So Urban II, upon getting this call for help, is going to summon the leaders of Europe, the most important individuals, to a council, the Council of Clermont, held in 1095, where he calls upon Christians to take up their weapons against the infidel, i.e. Muslims, and join a holy war to recover the Holy Land. Holy Land here referring to Palestine, what eventually will be fought over between Israel and Palestine, centered around Jerusalem. And these are the lands corresponding to the early history of Christianity, important events in the life of Jesus. Most important, of course, being his crucifixion, burial, and resurrection, all of which, according to Christian tradition, took place in Jerusalem. Right? And so, in fairness, from the point of Europe, it was only a few hundred years ago that The Holy Land had been under Christian rule, and then later on had come under Muslim rule. So from their point of view, it's a matter of reclaiming these holy territories. And as added incentive, the Pope promises remission of sins, i.e. all who die in battle against the pagans would have their sins forgiven. So basically a one-way ticket to heaven. And from a military point of view, the Crusades are pretty successful, right? So they march off, these knights march off to the Byzantine Empire. As soon as they get there, the Byzantine Emperor recognizes that they seem to have their own agenda. And in fact, they really don't get along too well. From the Crusaders' perspective, the Byzantines seem very foreign. Orthodoxy isn't for them recognizably Christian. And before too long, the emperor sends them on their way to the Holy Land. And they, quote-unquote, liberate, from their point of view, Jerusalem in 1099 and go on to create 4 Crusader states. So the map here shows the Crusader states that they were able to establish. And over the next few centuries, the borders will fluctuate. Some will be lost. New territories gained as more and more Crusaders arrive. And you're going to have actually, from the point of view of historians, a series of Crusades. We often talk about the first, the second, the third Crusade, and so forth. Through it all, the 4 primary Crusader states are the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and most importantly, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. And, you know, up until this point, I do want to make, 3 points here. First of all, the Crusaders, when they first took Jerusalem, were incredibly brutal. Even by their own accounts, they claim that the streets ran red with blood up to the ankles of their, to the knees of their horses. And they pretty much, when they entered Jerusalem, slaughtered everyone, including Christians and Jews, right? So, I mean, it was kind of a very brutal event. Second of all, up until that point, by this time, Jerusalem had become something of a backwater in the Islamic world. It wasn't like an important center of trade. It wasn't on any caravan route on the road to pilgrimage or anything like that. And certainly, you know, very little economic or political importance, but it was considered to be a holy city in Islam. Today is considered to be the 3rd holiest city in Islam. You know, that partly explains why the Crusaders were able to take it. And the third point I want to make is the reputation of Europe at this point was so poor that nobody really imagined that you know, these barbarians from Europe might somehow arrive and actually put up a good fight. So this, you know, they were more prepared to deal with threats coming from other directions, particularly when you had this kind of ongoing conflict, not just with the Byzantine Empire, but between the Seljuks and Fatimids. In any event, the success of the Crusaders in establishing states ended up being a kind of wake-up call and then later on a rallying point for Muslims. And so it became very important, this idea of liberating Jerusalem. And eventually that will happen under Saladin. In English we say Saladin. More properly we might say Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub. And I want to point out he's not Arab, he's actually a Kurdish military leader, but he ends up uniting the Muslim world, first conquering the Fatimids, driving them out of Egypt, and then uniting Egypt with Syria so as to effectively surround the Crusader states, and then finally driving the Crusaders out themselves in 1187. Unlike the Crusaders, Saladin is very generous with those he defeats. He allows many of the Christians to leave with their property, and then even makes arrangements to allow Christians to make pilgrimage to the Christian holy sites in the Holy Land. And I should note that his reputation as being, you know, an extremely just and merciful individual is one held in his depiction by Europeans. He's often presented by Europeans in European historical accounts as being this very chivalrous military leader. In any event, he goes on to found the Ayyubid Dynasty, which will be based in Egypt, and which, in order to stay in power, very quickly becomes dependent on Mamluk armies. And here we see the Ayyubid Empire at its greatest extent. And so never really quite bringing together the entire Middle East, but certainly major parts of it.
So when I say that the Ayyubids became somewhat dependent on their Mamluk armies, I'm thinking primarily of the succession. When a particular Ayyubid sultan would die, there would be a number of different claimants to the throne. They had a kind of a tradition, rather than having the sultan designate a specific individual as heir or an idea about the eldest male heir being the next in line. There would be a number of claimants who would basically fight it out with their respective Mamluk armies. And it was pretty much a fight to the death. So eventually one individual would be left standing, at which point they would then incorporate the Mamluks of those who had been vanquished into their own particular army. And then eventually the whole process would pretty much repeat itself. But within this kind of pattern that was developing, the Mamluks were becoming especially powerful. And eventually one of them, the commander of one such Mamluk army, a fellow named Ayyubid, would seize power for himself. And actually the process by which that happened was fairly complex. To be honest, you could almost write a soap opera around it. But the basic short version of it is that one Mamluk individual, Ayyubid, eventually seized power and is going to establish a new sultanate, the Mamluk Sultanate, which is pretty much based on this kind of Mamluk system that had become established. But now it's going to be a little bit different, right? So, I mean, first of all, in one sense, this kind of idea of a number of different claimants fighting it out after the sultan died would carry forward, except, now it would have nothing to do with whether an individual is related to the sultan. In fact, the children of Mamluks were not allowed to become Mamluk soldiers themselves. They would eventually kind of filter down into the larger population, and they would just keep bringing in new recruits, prisoners of war and so forth, who would then be inducted into the Mamluk system. Eventually, some of them would rise to the position of commander, and when the sultan died, the commanders of various regiments would fight it out to determine who the next sultan was. Part of the reason the Mamluks actually ended up seizing power is that shortly after that happened, the whole region was confronted with the threat of the Mongol invasion, which is pretty much happening all across the globe, not counting the Americas at this point. And so the Mamluks had basically been overrunning the Middle East. It's finally the Mamluks who are going to be able to put a stop to that. And that is with the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine in 1260, after which the Mamluks are able to consolidate their power over Syria. And eventually they bring Mecca and Medina under their control as well. So they become the dominant sultanate in the region at that point. And we should note, in connection with the Mongol invasion of the Middle East, the Abbasid Caliphate finally comes to an end. And this would be under Hulagu. This is actually the grandson of Genghis Khan, who had initially united the Mongols, who would then eventually go on to overrun not just the Middle East, but also China and much of Europe, at least the eastern part of Europe. In the Middle East, their armies are led by Hulagu. And at some point, they basically raze Baghdad to the ground and eliminate the caliphate by killing the Abbasid Caliph and all his family members. So there's basically no one left to carry on the line. And it's worth kind of noting the manner of their execution, which was pretty brutal. Basically had all the members of the Abbasid family rolled up into carpets and then had them trampled to death with horses. And so that really is the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. There are no caliphs after that point. The Mamluks will kind of half-heartedly try to promote the idea that there was one survivor of the Abbasid family, but it never really becomes accepted by the vast majority of Muslims. But the idea of a caliphate will carry on into the modern period. So I don't want to get too much into that, but later on, as an idea, it will be kind of revitalized as perhaps a basis for Arab unity within the context of Arab nationalism. But that's, really looking down the road to the late 19th, early 20th century. In the meantime, the Mamluks become the dominant sultanate in the region for some time, 1400 kind of marking the high point of their power. We can see much of the Middle East is under their control, including Mecca and Medina, which By this point, having control of the two holiest cities in Islam is a very prestigious thing, kind of legitimizes one's rule, and with it comes responsibility for managing the Hajj. And that brings us to the next great ruling empire in the Middle East, which is pretty much going to carry right up until the modern period, and that would be the Ottoman Empire. As you can see from the map in the upper right-hand corner, as marked in dark green, pretty much encompassing the entirety of the Middle East with the exception of Iran, also most of North Africa, and a good chunk of Southeast Europe. So this is going to be a massive empire, a very powerful one. And I think we very briefly noted at the very beginning when we were discussing which countries to include in the Middle East. I think I mentioned that if you're talking about Turkey, it's going to be part of not just Middle East history, but also European history. And to some degree, that reflects its relationship to, in some ways, its predecessor, the Ottoman Empire. We can see also some paraphernalia here, kind of reflecting symbols representative of that empire. Now, regarding the term Ottoman, that simply refers to the fact that you have the same ruling dynasty from beginning to end. Right from its very beginning at the end of the 13th century up to just a little bit after the First World War in the 20th. It essentially means the House of Osman. So it's going to be a dynasty initiated by Osman, meaning for the most part father to son, right up until the early 20th century. It's going to last just to a little bit past the First World War. So Osman I, born in 1258, at that time what today constitutes Turkey or Anatolia, to use the geographic term, primarily made up of a number of small provinces, for the most part beholden to Mongol overlords. And so Osman is the head of one such beylik who in 1299 declares it independent, establishing his own small kingdom, an Ottoman principality, and very quickly goes on to conquer a number of neighboring Turkish tribes and their beyliks, and with this, the Ottoman Empire is on its way. Eventually, he comes very close to Constantinople, even establishing his new capital directly across the Sea of Marmara from Constantinople at the city of Bursa, today a major city in the Republic of Turkey. But at that point, rather than going on to try and conquer what remained of the Byzantine Empire, the Ottomans now cross over to Europe, where they begin to conquer territory in Southeast Europe. The definitive battle in that regard is the Battle of Kosovo of 1389, which pretty much opens the floodgates to conquering a good chunk of Southeast Europe, effectively surrounding Constantinople. I mean, much of this coming at the expense of what remains of the Byzantine Empire. I should mention the chief adversary during this battle is going to be the Serbians. And even until today, for many Serbs, this battle, the Battle of Kosovo 1389, kind of a defining moment in their sense of, historically who they are as a people. So it's kind of worth noting that. If you ever run into anyone who is Serbian, it's pretty much guaranteed that they, have a lot to say about this particular battle. In any event, at some point, the Byzantine Empire has really shrunk down to just a small amount of territory around the city of Constantinople, maybe a few other territories, and is completely surrounded by the Ottoman Empire. And, looking back now with kind of historical hindsight, it seems pretty inevitable that at some point, the Ottoman are going to go after Constantinople. It obviously lends itself to being the capital of this new empire. It's very centrally located. It's kind of hard to imagine they're accepting this small kind of independent empire. And you almost can hardly call it an empire at this point, but it should be smack in the middle of theirs. But nonetheless, it's still not an easy thing to take the city. It's very famous at this point for its formidable defensive walls that are very hard to breach. And it's surrounded by the sea on three sides. So it's still a difficult undertaking. But eventually, one of the Ottoman sultans is going to manage to take the city. And that would be Mehmet II, who conquers Constantinople on May 29th, 1453. And by the way, that is a date I expect you to remember. It's just one of those really monumental dates in human history. I should note, I mean, this event, the fall of Constantinople, marking also the end of the Byzantine Empire, is going to reverberate throughout Europe. And is seen as, kind of a sign of impending doom, of the end times, you name it. I mean, people are really freaking out. But in any event, it now becomes the capital of the Ottoman Empire. I should also make note that part of the reason the Ottoman are able to take the city is that they have learned how to really utilize gunpowder militarily. And one of the first empires to really use gunpowder militarily on a large scale, invented in China, but until then used primarily for fireworks and maybe minimally militarily. Here they're creating these massive cannons that really help them to breach the walls. So now the capital of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman are not done expanding. They will continue to do so under Selim I, who ruled from 1512 to 1520. Always loved his nicknames, the Grim or the Brave, apparently a reputation of not someone, shall we say, overly inclined to laughter. Under him, the Mamluk Sultanate will come to an end in 1517. Which also means that at that point the Ottoman bring the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina under their control. And from this point on, they're really going to promote the idea that they are the defenders of Sunni Islam. And responsible for the Hajj, for preserving the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. So using Islam as a way to legitimize their rule. Related to this, they take the title of Caliph. It's not something they really, a title they try to take much advantage of. It really is kind of a symbolic thing. They're never going to assert, for instance, any kind of religious authority connected with that. And as a further indication of the symbolic nature of this, they claim also the emblems of the caliphate, the sword and mantle of Muhammad, which will come to be housed in Constantinople in the Pavilion of the Holy Mantle. Here we see the mantle of Muhammad. And over here, the sword of Muhammad. These are what we call religious relics. So, kind of certain ideas develop about their having certain holy qualities because in this case of their connection with Muhammad. You have the same basic ideas in other religions, most notably in Christianity. Anything associated with the life of Jesus, for instance, might be perceived as having a kind of holy quality or things associated with certain saints. So kind of like that. But again, a lot of this is really kind of political, kind of a way of legitimizing the Ottoman right to rule as defenders of, and we might say at this point, Sunni Islam, because around this time we're going to see a great Shiite empire emerge in roughly what corresponds to Iran, and that would be the Safavid Empire, which we will talk about in a bit more detail momentarily. The first major confrontation between these two empires will be the Battle of Chaldiran, which ends with a decisive victory for the Ottoman Empire. This takes place in 1514, after which the Ottomans are able to consolidate their control over all of Anatolia, what roughly corresponds to modern-day Turkey. And so it does also kind of mark the defining border, not just between these two empires, but to some degree between the Sunni and Shiite worlds, and later on between kind of corresponding to the modern-day borders between Turkey and Iran. Part of the reason the Ottomans were so successful is they simply had a larger, better equipped army, about 200,000 versus 50 to 80,000. And they had really, in terms of technology, had gone far ahead in the development of firearms using gunpowder, something that the Safavids had not really taken advantage of until then. And all of this proved to be decisive. But in some ways, these two now become kind of the superpowers of the Middle East, right? The one representing Sunni Islam, the other one Shiite Islam. The high point of the Ottoman Empire probably comes under Suleiman the Magnificent, during which time the Ottoman Empire will continue to expand. Under him, they capture Belgrade in Europe in 1521, go on to defeat the Kingdom of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs 5 years later, bringing much of what today constitutes Hungary under Ottoman control, and even at some point laying siege to Vienna in 1529. And that was a pretty scary moment for Europe, right? I mean, there really was this kind of feeling that if Vienna were to fall, it would open the floodgates to the infidel and they would overrun the entirety of Europe. In the end, they didn't take Vienna. And some historians looking back would argue that there's just kind of a point where you're moving too far away from the center in order to maintain control of territory. And then there's also the whole problem of maintaining supply lines to the army and so forth. Particularly back in the day, you would fight campaigns during the summer, and if you weren't able to conquer something by the winter, you basically went home. But they don't take Vienna. They also continue to expand to the east, taking Baghdad from the Safavids in 1535. And just for fun, I thought I'd put up next to the photo of Suleiman, his favorite wife, Roxolana, who is, by the way, buried next to him, even though she might have convinced him to kill his eldest son, kind of one of these kind of palace intrigue kind of stories. But she was, apparently considered to be very beautiful, very charming, probably of either Russian or Ukrainian extract. But again, if you were to visit his tomb, you'd find her buried next door. And here we see the expansion of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman. So this is pretty much the Ottoman Empire at its greatest extent, including much of Southeast Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. This map is kind of color-coded to indicate when different parts of the empire were brought under Ottoman control. And here we see a European artistic depiction of the Siege of Vienna in 1529, just kind of an indication of how significant an event this was considered to be from a European perspective.
At this point, I'd like to consider some of the factors underlying the success of the Ottoman Empire. And by pretty much any measure, it was a very successful empire, whether in terms of longevity or the vastness of the territory that it brought under its control. So probably the key factor was a kind of flexibility, and this was especially evident with respect to Ottoman administration. If it worked, they were quite happy to adopt it. So you end up with a blend of influences, beginning, of course, with their own Turkish nomadic heritage, but then as they brought various territories under their control, pretty much adopting different practices as they encountered them, and that would include Byzantine, but also, of course, Islamic practices. They were famous for utilizing the talents of all its people and a willingness to adopt the administrative practices of these various peoples they conquered. So that meant not only maintaining administrative institutions that they encountered, leaving them in place, but very often keeping the same personnel in place, regardless of ethnicity or religion. So you have in many areas large numbers of Christians that are in important positions administratively. And they would, of course, develop certain practices common to the empire as a whole. Maybe most important was the development of a common language of administration, Ottoman Turkish, which really has to be distinguished from present-day Turkish, what they speak in the modern state of Turkey. For one thing, Ottoman Turkish was written in Arabic script. Modern-day Turkish, the modern Turkish language is written using Latin letters. Ottoman Turkish also borrowed heavily from Arabic and Persian, not just in terms of vocabulary, but also grammatically. Now, one other clear indication of flexibility had to do with the position of Sultan. Of course, the Sultan was at the top of the political hierarchy, but very often when they conquered different territories, they would adopt different titles reflective of different kinds of relationships with different subject populations. So in the east, closer to Iran, the title Padishah, which reflects Iranian political traditions, was often used. We already discussed how the sultans at some point adopt the title of caliph as a way of kind of utilizing Islam to legitimize their rule, presenting themselves as defenders of the Sunni faith. I didn't mention when they conquered Constantinople, they also adopted the title of Caesars, kind of a way of demonstrating respect for, up until then, existing Byzantine practices. Now, in theory, the sultans did have both political and religious authority, but much as we discuss with respect to sultans in general, the real religious authority lied with the ulama. And so the sultan very much respected that fact. They would do things to kind of show their respect for the ulama, patronizing them, providing funding for the building of mosques and schools and so forth. And the ulama in return would acknowledge the authority of the sultan. Now, with respect to the succession, we find, at least early on, something not unlike what we saw with the Ayyubids, right? So there might be a number of different claimants to the throne. Usually it would be the sons of the previous sultan. In anticipation of the eventual struggle for succession, all the sons would be highly trained, very often given important positions in government, in order to prepare them to eventually govern, but also as a way of eliminating those physically or mentally unfit, something that would become very readily apparent by virtue of giving them responsibility. When the sultan finally died, his sons would fight it out for the sultanate, with the winner then executing all other potential pretenders to the throne. And I know that might seem pretty harsh, but that really could avoid a host of problems down the road. Later on, they would kind of drop that practice of executing the sultan executing his siblings. Rather, they would consign them to the harem, where they could while away the rest of their days rather pleasurably, but completely cut off from any connection with government. Now, the sultan, of course, had ultimate authority, but they were advised by a council of ministers known as the divan. The ministers were known as viziers, and usually there would be one very important vizier, the highest ranking one, known as the grand vizier. And later on, like for a long time, up at least until Suleiman the Magnificent, you have really strong, charismatic sultans who really, directly wield power. Later on, that will become less frequently the case, and you might actually have a situation where the viziers are pretty much kind of governing the empire on behalf of the sultans. And there could even be other individuals that might exercise a great deal of influence and even some degree of authority. This was especially apparent with the harem, the private chambers of the sultan, where he and his family members, when he was off duty, where he resided. Harem often in kind of the popular Western conception, filled with women devoted to the pleasure of the sultan. There is some element of truth to this, but it's really more about it being kind of his personal chambers where he can let his hair down. And related to that, right? I mean, this is, individuals occupying the harem would have had a kind of unique, much more personal access to the sultan, and therefore, by extension, potentially greater influence. And this was especially true with respect to the mother of the sultan. The Valide sultan would have been a highly respected figure, and age and the fact of being a parent would have conferred upon them tremendous respect on behalf of the sultan. And so they had tremendous influence. This really became apparent during the late 16th and 17th centuries, a period that historians sometimes refer to as the Sultanate of Women because of that. That might actually be a factor in the eventual decline of the Ottoman Empire, that you had kind of, more weak-minded sultans, more easily influenced by outside individuals. But before we get to that, I wanted to look at one very important example of the flexibility of Ottoman government, and that has to do with something called the millet system. A millet refers to a specific religious community within the Ottoman Empire. The term actually very often can be translated as nation or community, but in this case referring to the different non-Muslim religious communities in the Ottoman Empire. And so the basic idea was that each religious community constituted a separate millet, and these were pretty much allowed to govern themselves autonomously to a really great extent. So long as they paid their taxes and didn't make trouble, they pretty much could govern themselves by their own religious laws, follow their own religious traditions and so forth, and could operate fairly independently. The first proper millet was designated after the conquest of Constantinople, and that was the Orthodox Christian community, which from that point forward was permitted to basically abide by the Justinian Code, which had pretty much been operative within the Ottoman Empire. And so the way this worked is basically the Sultan would designate the head of that religious community, in this case the Millet of Rum, kind of a reference to the Roman connection there, would designate the head of that religious community responsible for it as a whole. They became a kind of intermediary between the Sultan and the larger community, very often, for instance, collecting taxes from, in this case, Orthodox Christians, and then, kind of sending that along to the Sultan's government. So the first head of the Millet of Rum was the actual patriarch in Constantinople. Another title was ethnarch, and that was Gennadius II Scholarius. And eventually other millets would be designated corresponding to the Armenian Orthodox community, to the Jewish community, even eventually to Protestants, which at this point, well, there are hardly any in Europe, much less the Middle East. Of course, the Ottomans are famous for their military success, hence why they ended up with such a large empire. A number of factors underlying this. We already mentioned that they were the first to take advantage of gunpowder, so a certain kind of technological advancement in that regard. Certainly important with respect to cannons when laying siege to a city, but also in the use of muskets. Something reflective of their kind of Central Asian nomadic heritage, the Timar system. So early on, probably the most important element within the Ottoman army would have been the cavalry. Cavalrymen would serve the Ottoman Sultan in return for a fief, a very large area of land known as a timar. So somewhat similar to what you have in Europe during the Middle Ages, where a noble, a high-ranking knight, would fight on behalf of the king and then be given authority over this large area of land on behalf of the king, or in this case, behalf of the sultan. And finally, they really excelled at certain tactics involving short swords and bows that sometimes gave them a tactical advantage. This again reflected their nomadic heritage. Eventually, they developed a elite fighting force known as the Janissaries that would actually become the terror of Europe. I mean, they were really extremely well-trained, very effective fighters. And in some ways, this fighting force resembles very much the various Mamluk armies that we talked about historically before now. So the way the Janissaries came about, you had a system known as devshirme, a kind of human taxation system. And Christian families within the Ottoman Empire would be required to turn over at least some of their young male children at an early age, who would then be converted to Islam and then trained for various kinds of functions, some to become administrators and so forth within the Ottoman government. But those who showed a potential for, kind of military service would be trained to become Janissaries. And so, much like the Mamluks as well, they were perceived as a kind of slave caste devoted to the service of the Sultan, something reflected in the term kapikulu. But in fact, much like the Mamluks, they eventually became extremely powerful. So early on, it was pretty kind of rigid system. If you became a Janissary, you were confined to the barracks. You couldn't become married. You couldn't really intermingle with kind of the locals wherever you were stationed. But that eventually would kind of fall to the wayside. And very often within local communities, they would become extremely important, extremely powerful individuals, eventually taking wives, intermingling, becoming engaged in various kind of business activities and so forth, and very jealous of preserving their status as this kind of elite fighting force. That will eventually become a problem for the Sultan. But they are very effective.
And finally, we should note that the Ottoman had a very powerful navy during the 16th century at least. One figure that really stands out here, a fellow named Barbarossa, at least that's how he was known in Europe, kind of seen as a sort of pirate figure, more properly Khair al-Din Pasha, the admiral of the Ottoman Navy. Might interest some of you to know that the word admiral in English comes from Arabic, as in Amir al-Bahar, Amir al, eventually becoming admiral. And certainly under him, the Ottoman dominated the Mediterranean. particularly in the eastern part, but eventually all of it. So, for instance, at some point they bring an end to the Spanish occupation of Tunis and Algeria. Later on, during the Spanish Inquisition, they would play a very important role in evacuating large numbers of Muslims and Jews. Spain was throwing them out, and the Ottoman Empire was like, you don't want them? We'll take them. Many of them ended up being settled within Ottoman territory. And finally, and I just kind of threw this in there as an example that not everything was about religion even back in the 16th century. So for instance, 1543, Barbarossa allying himself with the French fleet against the Holy Roman Empire, right? So the two of them united in their opposition to Habsburg Spain. So there you have the greatest Muslim power of the Mediterranean world uniting with a Catholic power against another Catholic power. So most of what we've talked about until now really reflecting kind of the glory days of the Ottoman Empire, but there is one other development and corresponding to the same period, but which eventually will have a very, very negative consequence on the Ottoman Empire. And so I do want to highlight this, definitely extremely important, and that is the capitulations. So what are the capitulations? They were kind of like trading rights or grants made by successive sultans to Christian nations, basically conferring rights and privileges to their Christian subjects when they were trading in the Ottoman dominions, right? So the basic idea that, for instance, if you were a French merchant operating within the Ottoman Empire, you would have been not subject to Ottoman law and not subject to many Ottoman taxes. And this would have conferred upon you a tremendous advantage with respect to your Ottoman competitors within the empire. Now, initially this was supposed to work in both directions, right? So that Ottoman traders operating in European states would enjoy similar rights and privileges. And so, at the time, it probably seemed like a good idea. The first European power to be granted such rights and privileges was France, in honor of the alliance between Suleiman the Magnificent and the French King Francis I during the mid-16th century in connection with the naval alliance that we just mentioned. And so, initially it really only involved a relatively small number of individuals, but over time it would really become a much, much bigger factor in how European states engage with the Ottoman Empire. You just have kind of an increasing number of European subjects operating in the Ottoman Empire, and really not much happening in the other direction, right? And so it's something that the European powers would eventually abuse to a great extent and would become a mechanism by which they were able to impose themselves, certainly economically, but to some extent also politically on the Ottoman Empire as well. And so that's kind of a story for later on. And indeed, at some point, decline does begin to set in. Of course, it wouldn't really have been apparent at the time, but historians looking back with the benefit of hindsight often date this period of decline as beginning with the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. And that was a pretty decisive Spanish naval victory over the Ottomans. From that point on, Spain will become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. And again, looking back, it's pretty apparent that, from that point forward, the Ottoman Empire is losing battles more often than it's winning. That doesn't mean that, they weren't perceived as a significant threat, and every now and then, they could really put the fear of God, if you will, into Europe. They were able to lay siege to Vienna again in 1683, this time turned back by an alliance of European kings, if you will, eventually kind of saving the city. But for the most part, from that point forward, it's really kind of a continuing story of, at least militarily, of decline, right? Where they're losing wars, losing territory, and probably the point at which it really became apparent to people in that time, certainly to Ottoman officials, that there is a serious problem here, was with the outcome of the Great Turkish War in 1699, which concluded with the Treaty of Karlowitz, and which saw the Ottomans forced to cede vast amounts of territory, nearly all of Hungary, Transylvania, not going to make any vampire jokes here, and some smaller territories like the Morea and Podolia. And so we're going to come back to this kind of issue of decline of the Ottoman Empire. That really is much more corresponding to the modern period. Before we do that, I'd like now to talk about the Safavid Empire. So the Safavids were the chief rivals of the Ottoman during much of the period that we've been looking at. The Ottoman Empire eventually becoming the dominant Sunni Muslim power in the region, Safavids becoming the dominant Shiite power, and territorially roughly corresponding to modern-day Iran, at least what we might call the imperial heartland, very often conquering territories beyond those borders. So they started out as a Sufi order, the Safaviya Sufi order. And we haven't really talked about Sufism. It's not a sect of Islam, but rather reflects certain practices related to mysticism. And related to that, and in this case, it is a Sunni Sufi order, but in connection with this kind of accentuation of mysticism, finding kind of many points of overlap with Shi'ism, so in some ways kind of facilitating that transition. The Safavids themselves would claim to be descended from the Imam Ali and his wife Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, through the seventh Imam, Musa al-Kazim, though I should note they would ultimately promote Twelver Shi'ism, right? So kind of, promoting the idea that in terms of legitimizing their right to rule, the dynasty could claim descent from one of the Imams, but, at the end of the day, promoting this kind of Twelver form of Shi'ism, which, followed a different line of descent, ending with the 12th Imam, who, as you might recall, was considered to be in a state of occultation or hiding. The rise of the Safavids corresponded to an alliance made between these Sufi mystics and certain Shiite militant groups known as the Qizilbash. And this happened under Sheikh Junaid, the head of the Sufi order, who in a very conscious way sought to transform what was ultimately a religious order into a political power. And so this would be accomplished by forming an alliance with militant groups known as the Qizilbash. This is actually an Ottoman Turkish term meaning redheads and referred to their distinct headwear, probably the most notable feature of which was the 12 points that the hats feature, right? And these would have corresponded to the 12 Shiite Imams, right? Hence the fact that they are Twelvers. And with their help, they were eventually able to found the Safavid dynasty. This actually kind of started in roughly what constitutes the northwestern part of Iran and the modern state of Azerbaijan, but eventually they would bring all of what constitutes Iran under their control. Probably the most significant development would be under Ismail I, right, the Shah of Iran from 1501 to 1524, and it's under him that Iran would be transformed from a predominantly Sunni state into a Shiite one. And this would effectively be done by force, right? So, basically it started with the ulama. They were basically compelled to adopt Shi'ism on pain of death. If they chose not to, they would have to either go into exile or eventually find themselves killed. And so at some point, and it really did happen rather quickly, but at some point the bulk of the ulama had adopted Shi'ism, and then eventually through them it permeated into the rest of the population. Ismail himself would claim to be descended from the Imam Ali and his wife Fatima, again through the seventh Imam, Musa al-Kazim. And this is where the Safavid dynasty really began to promote this idea of not really being proper imams themselves, but having this kind of connection with respect to the seventh imam. And so just by way of reminding us regarding this kind of schism that would emerge in Shi'ism, based on differences of opinion about who should be the successor of the preceding imam, and this happened generationally with the fifth generation, where you have fivers splitting off from the mainstream, and then with the seveners splitting off at the seventh generation. But to be clear, even though the Safavids themselves are claiming descent from the seventh Imam, it is not Ismail, it is Musa al-Kazim, and they themselves were Twelvers, right? So kind of running down the line to al-Muntazir, who they considered to have gone into a state of hiding and occultation. So eventually the Safavids have become a major rival to the Ottomans. We already discussed the first major encounter, the Battle of Chaldiran, which took place in 1514 and was a decisive victory of the Ottoman Empire over the Safavids. And again, noting that this would end up kind of defining the border between the two empires, between the kind of Sunni and Shiite worlds within the Middle East, and roughly, kind of corresponding to the border that would eventually emerge between Iraq and Iran. One thing that was clear to the Safavids after their decisive defeat at the hands of the Ottoman is that they needed to reform their military. And this would happen under the individual generally considered to be their greatest ruler, the Shah Abbās I. And by the way, you probably noticed by now that they don't use the title Sultan, rather they use the title Shah, which is kind of an ancient Iranian title that predates Islam. So kind of, reflecting an indigenous Iranian political tradition. In any event, Abbas I took the throne following the forced abdication of his father, Shah Muhammad Khudabanda, and he was known as Abbas the Great, and he's generally considered to be the greatest ruler of the Safavid dynasty. So, as already mentioned, a lot of reform taking place of the military under his rule, and also in an effort to secure the capital, kind of relocating it further to the interior, away from the frontier, at the city of Isfahan. And Isfahan would go on to become this, incredibly beautiful center of, kind of intellectual activity, cultural center. And this is definitely a period when the Safavid Empire is thriving, whether you're talking about culturally, economically, and also politically. And so, if you were a tourist going to Iran today, Isfahan would probably be, destination point number one. As you can see from some of these images, a very beautiful city. We see here Nagsha-e-Jahan Square, Shah Mosque, and so forth. Regarding the military reform, one interesting aspect of this was the part played by two English brothers, travelers and adventurers who just happened to be passing through Persia in 1598 during the rule of Abbas I, and this was Robert and Anthony Shirley. So they end up being hired by the Shah to train the Persian army according to the rules and customs of the English militia. So kind of, introducing some, for that time, modern developments that were then taking place in Europe. Among other things, this would include the introduction of gunpowder on a much grander scale, right? Something that had given the Ottoman Empire a distinct advantage. So the soldiers of the Safavid army being trained to use artillery. And one other major reform that really in a very, very overt way mimics the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, they create this new kind of elite fighting force known as the Ghulams. And it works exactly the same way as the Ottoman Janissaries, where you have these slaves who are conscripted during their youth from Christian families, primarily Armenian, Georgian, and Circassian families. And so, converted to Islam. And then if they show a proclivity for kind of military activities, would have been trained to become part of this elite fighting force, right? So, same basic deal that you had with the Janissaries. And as we can see, under Abbas I, the Safavid Empire is going to become quite large. So, definitely the kind of what we might call imperial heartland, roughly corresponding to modern-day Iran, and that's at the center of this map here. But also frequently conquering territory in roughly what corresponds to modern-day Iraq. That actually goes a long way to explaining why a large number of Arabs in Iraq are Shiite, and also conquering territory in Central Asia. And even until now, you see evidence of Iranian cultural influence in that part of the world. After Abbas I, it's kind of downhill from that point forward, in part because of two expanding empires to the north and south of the Safavids. So to the north, you have the Russian Empire, which is beginning to conquer territory in Central Asia. So these kind of correspond to the modern states of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, the stans, right? Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and so forth. And so, kind of falling out of the Iranian sphere of influence and into the Russian one. And of course, if you go to these places today, Sometimes the Russian cultural influence has somewhat obscured this much more ancient Iranian one. So, for instance, Russian would be a much more common second language in these countries. Coming from the south, we have the Mughal Empire being established in India. That's expanding northward at the expense of the Safavids to some degree. And then after that, it's going to be the British Empire in India. And so the Safavids and then subsequent dynasties, we might just say Iran, eventually becoming, kind of the meat within a sandwich, being squeezed from the north by the Russians and from the south by the British. But by then, we in fact have a new dynasty in Iran, and that would be the Qajar Dynasty, which begins in 1785. And so this is actually a pretty good place to start. This has kind of all been leading up to the point at which the relationship between the Middle East and Europe is going to dramatically change, where Europe is going to be perceived as posing a major threat, whether the fear of being directly colonized by Europe, but also just kind of a growing concern about European influence, not just politically, but economically, culturally, socially, and so forth. I'll mention one last thing in connection with the Qajar dynasty before we stop. They relocate the capital to a village kind of deeper into the interior, and the name of that village is Tehran. And of course, that is the modern capital of the present-day state of Iran. So this is, again, a good place to stop. And when we return, we'll begin with what most historians consider to be the beginning of the modern period, the French occupation of Egypt in 1798.